Imagine being fluent in two completely different worlds. There is a generation that remembers perfectly when phones had a cable, when you had to memorize phone numbers, and when, if you missed a TV show, you had simply lost it forever. But that same generation was also the first to open Messenger, the first to create a MySpace, and the first to experience the arrival of the iPhone. Psychologists even have a name for this rare in-between state, a kind of cultural bilingualism. And if you were born approximately between 1976 and 1985, it might finally explain why you have always felt like you don't quite belong anywhere. Psychologists are still discussing where to fit these people because they are not entirely Generation X, but they are not really millennials either. If you were born approximately between 1976 and 1985, you probably belong to what some researchers began to call a few years ago Xennials, a kind of microgeneration. And the interesting thing is not just the label, because what happened in those years created something that psychologists consider quite strange, a generation that learned two completely different ways of living life before turning 30. The interesting thing is what happened exactly at that moment in history, because that small interval of years created something psychologically very peculiar. The Xennials grew up in a completely analog world, a world where boredom was not solved with a screen. To hang out with friends, you had to call home and wait for your parents to answer the phone. You stayed with your friends in a specific place, a square, the door of the cinema, the bus stop, and you just waited. Because there was no way to notify. Where if you arrived late somewhere, you could not send a message saying, "I'm on my way." Either you arrived or your friends left. That kind of life required something that today has almost disappeared: trust and commitment. If you said you were going to be there at 6, there was a good chance that everyone was there at 6. But when the Xennials were entering adulthood, the world changed completely. And it did not change little by little, it changed suddenly. In a matter of a few years, mobile phones, internet at home, Messenger, MySpace, Facebook appeared. Perhaps you also remember things like the Messenger buzz, customizing your MySpace profile, or spending hours changing your status so that someone specific would read it. Suddenly, there were dozens of ways to contact someone, and that generation simply adapted. This has a very interesting psychological explanation. According to multiple studies on brain development, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that helps us adapt to new situations, does not completely mature until around 25 years old. A study published in Nature Neuroscience showed that this region of the brain continues to develop well into the 20s. And what does this mean? That when the digital world exploded, many Xennials were exactly at that moment of maximum brain plasticity. They were young enough to quickly adapt to technology, but old enough to perfectly remember what the world was like before it. And that creates something very strange, a kind of cultural bilingualism. The older generations sometimes see technology with some mistrust. They did not grow up with it. The younger generations, on the other hand, never knew the world without the internet. But the Xennials experienced both realities. They know how to have a face-to-face conversation without looking at the phone every 10 seconds, but they do not feel anxiety when learning a new application either. They remember what it was like to be completely uncommunicated for hours, something that many younger people have never experienced. But at the same time, technology does not intimidate them either. And this mixture creates a quite particular mentality. For example, the relationship with privacy. The Xennials grew up in a world where shameful moments disappeared over time. That horrible haircut at high school, that party where you made a fool of yourself, that dramatic teenage breakup, all that was simply in people's memory, not on the internet. Not in photos, not in videos, not on social networks. And that profoundly changes how we remember our own life. Research on autobiographical memory suggests that the human brain is designed to edit memories. Over time, memories change, simplify, reinterpret, become stories. But when everything is permanently documented, that natural process becomes much more complicated. And the Xennials lived right at the transition point. But there is another important detail that almost no one mentions when talking about this generation. Many Xennials entered the labor market around the 2008 financial crisis, just as they were trying to build stability. And that leaves a mark. Research on financial stress shows that economic difficulties during that stage of life can generate a persistent feeling of insecurity even years later, even when the situation improves. That is why many people of this generation developed a particular relationship with money, a mixture of adaptability and caution. They learned to move in a changing world. But at the same time, there is a small mental voice that sometimes whispers, "What if everything collapses again?" And here the great paradox appears. The Xennials grew up before parental hyperprotection. Their parents often did not know exactly where they were for hours. And that was completely normal. They learned to entertain themselves, to solve problems, to tolerate boredom. But at the same time, they reached adulthood just when the internet promised to connect everyone. Before we understood that this connection would also bring new problems. So this generation lives in a kind of permanent contradiction. Independent, but connected. Skeptical, but open to change. Analogical, but digital. And perhaps the most curious thing is that they can sustain those contradictions without feeling strange. The Xennials remember something that other generations did not live. They remember the before, and that is why they can clearly see what was gained, but also what was lost. The ability to disappear for a few hours was lost. The patience that is born from waiting was lost. A certain mental presence was lost that existed when nothing constantly competed for your attention. But something huge was also gained. Immediate access to information and global connection. Opportunities that simply did not exist before. Perhaps that is why many Xennials have a curious feeling. The feeling of not fitting in at all anywhere. Too young for some things. Too old for others. As if you had always arrived right in the middle of two worlds. And perhaps that is why many people of this generation have a very particular ability. To understand that the world is changing, but identity does not have to be lost in the process. Because in a world that is changing faster and faster, having lived a great historical transition can be one of the most valuable skills that exist. Knowing how to adapt without losing who you are. If you felt identified with this, you probably already know why. And if you are interested in better understanding the psychology behind how we live, think, and make decisions, you can subscribe to the channel. Here we explore that kind of thing. See you in the next video.